Good morning. Can you all hear me? Excellent. We are the warm-up act for the politics session. You will be pleased to hear that we listened to your feedback last year, and we want this session to have a really good Q&A. So we are going to hear from Ged Futter in a moment about our report, but I would like you all to be thinking about the questions that you would like to ask. There will be roving mics in this room and the app for those in the East School. So please start thinking about what questions you'd like to ask about supply chain. This report is really important to me. Those of you that know me, I chair British Apples and Pears. I do a lot of work with the NFU. I talk to a lot of farmers and growers, and they're struggling. And they are struggling because there are issues in the supply chain, probably like we've never seen before. We covered supply chain in the OFC report last year. We felt it was important to look at it again. And I'm really pleased that Council have had the confidence to make this the opening session. Thank you to all my fellow Council members. Why does it matter? Because it is starting to dramatically affect profitability. I think it's really important to put that word out there from the start. I think there are people who think that farmers shouldn't make a profit or that we're a charity. I want to put it out there that if farmers are not making a profit, they cannot reinvest in their businesses. And if you're not reinvesting in your business, you're not moving forward. So this, for me, this report is about the lack of profitability coming back down to farm gate. I want to thank very much our sponsors, Horridge Farrelly, for their support in the report. And I'd like to introduce you to my panel. First of all, we have Ged Futter from Retail Minds. Ged, thank you for authoring this report. When I first asked him, he said no. But anyway, we persuaded him. And Ged has had years of retail buying experience, and then latterly, consultancy experience advising suppliers with their negotiations into retail. So a foot in both camps. He sees both sides. So that's Ged. Here I have Robert Chapman, who is the MD of Farmlay. Some really amazing statistics: 500,000 hens, 25 contract producers, 5 million eggs a week for Lidl and Aldi. That's quite impressive. Strong Scottish accent, so tune in. Here I have Dr. Chris Brown. Chris has actually had a very varied role and background, working first for ADAS and the Meat and Livestock Commission, and then M&S, before moving to ASDA in 2001. So he's been there a long time. And is
less of a CV, more of a criminal record for
currently responsible for the strategy and policy for farming, growing and seafood. And then on my far right, Tom Bradshaw, farmer and Deputy President of the NFU. So I don't know if I should say anything else. I think that says it all. Without further ado, so again, I'm just going to warn you, think about your questions, because we're not going to spend a lot of time speaking after Ged has presented the highlights. We want to hand over to you. So I don't want, I want to see a sea of hands going up. Ged, please tell us about the report.
Well, it's a real privilege to be here, but I do want to address probably one of the things you might be thinking at the front, or just thinking actually about the panel. Why do they all, nearly all look like me? We did try. One of the things that Ali and I were really clear about right at the start, actually, is we wanted the report to be diverse, to speak to many different people, and also we wanted the panel to be as diverse as we could from many different areas. And it wasn't for want of trying, so we tried to get as many different people as we could, but they still all ended up looking like me. But what I did do in the report, I spoke with over 40 different people from many different sectors. And when you actually add up the amount of experience that they had, There was over 1,000 years worth of experience from the people that I spoke to. And one of the most important things that, and the report sees that actually, it's the voices of some of those people. And actually what I've got now is some quotes, and actually I just want to use that as part of the theme to talk about. And the biggest one that came out of it actually is, that's the word risk. So farming has always had risk. There's always, you can't avoid that. But what there is now is the risk is far greater than it ever has been before. And it's been pushed more and more down the food supply chain. And actually, this is what's happened now. And I was speaking with Will earlier on, and he was saying that he's been speaking to farmers as well. Actually, is the question they're asking is it worth doing? And that is, that Ali talked about, is there has to be that level of profitability within it as well. Now, one of the things that we hear a lot is the finger always gets pointed at the retailers. It's all the retailers. It's all them. But in the report, when I was speaking to people, I was reminded as well that actually, without the retailers, then this is a huge part of the business. So if you think about, for a customer, and as an ex-buyer, then I always thought about the customer. 95% of people do their main shop in one of the big retailers. So the genie's out of the bottle. We can't go back. That can't be changed. So what you have to remember actually is, okay, well, if that's the case, then what are we going to do differently? Now, yes, there are some elements that retailers are responsible for. And if you think about the amount of experience that I spoke to, buyers are more inexperienced now than they ever have been before. And I've been saying that for years, not just me getting older, they are getting younger. So that is a responsibility, actually, but also things like the audit burden. So there's a whole load of things that the retailers are responsible for, and there is change that needs to be made. But at the same time, we also have to see that for many years, actually, the whole sector hasn't been working together. And actually that we've seen, and as I spoke to so many different people, there are areas where we've had overproduction. So when you've got the difference between abundance and scarcity, for a buyer will thrive off abundance because they have choices. Now, when you have scarcity, a buyer has to think. And actually, that's something that I'll touch on later, because actually the scarcity makes a difference. So this whole thing is, so I heard actually the whole thing about last man standing. When someone leaves the sector, the volume is picked up by somebody else. You also have to think about that the retailers themselves, they are very well trained. And actually, is the sector as well trained to deal with all the retailers? So you have to make sure that you're doing that as well. This is something that I kept hearing so many times, that actually an empty bank account doesn't allow you to do anything at all. And actually, we know that that for so many years, the industry is such, you know what, we can see this through. We can ride through the tough times. Now, if you think about what's happened in the past 4 years, so back in 2019, we had Brexit, then we had COVID, then we've had the war in Ukraine, and this year the impact, certainly on food, has been very much about the climate. Now, during those 4 years, we actually had a 4-month period where the industry all worked together. Between April 2020 and July 2020, there was a phrase that nearly everybody was using. That phrase was "feed the nation." And that phrase came not just from farmers, but also from the retailers. That's what they were talking about. Everybody worked together. So we know that it can happen. So what we need to see actually is that the industry needs more investment, and it needs to work together. It is talked about that the buyers actually are, this is what they do. They are constant, their focus is relentless. This isn't a surprise. This is what buyers do every single day. So don't be surprised that all that they're talking about is how they get lower costs. But what you have to remember, and this is one thing that came out from the report, actually, someone said that actually it was almost, sometimes it's the equivalent of a pub team taking on a Premier League football team and losing 38-0 and then being surprised at the result and complaining that actually there needs to be change. There needs to be change, and there needs to be change about how you're working with the retailers as well. And we have got evidence that actually that it works. The whole thing between scarcity and abundance. We've seen scarcity in different sectors. We saw it with eggs. So Robert was speaking to me earlier on, and he said, the buyers were warned 3 years before the scarcity happened. This is what we're going to face into. Back in late 2021, we were already seeing food inflation rising, and actually it was turbocharged by the war in Ukraine. As a buyer, I was used to dealing with inflation of 2, 3, 4%. 5% was high. And we've been seeing costs, particularly in farming, 30% plus. So that is unsustainable. And egg farmers said, we can't do that. So they didn't. What that meant is there were no eggs. So the industry had to work together. And actually what we saw, actually, when you have got that scarcity, retailers have to do something different. We have to remember this is the reality. The quality standards in farming for the product in the UK is the best in the world. And the more that buyers look to go further afield, the more risk we are adding in to the food supply chain. There are alternatives. This is something that was talked about. So managing through diversification. Now, one of the things that diversification might have to happen is, well, I want to stop growing food. And it might be, well, we'll have, and someone's on the report talked about it being solar panels. So this is what diversification might look like. But actually, you have to think about, well, what else is there? And the whole audit burden. So one supplier was audited 40 times in 1 year. Each audit costs in excess of £2,500. Now, this is the reality, that actually there is a belief that the UK retailers, there is a sea of plenty out there, and actually there will always be that abundance. That's not the reality. And we can replace it with an import. Now, if you work with any of the UK retailers, you will know that they are expensive and complicated to deal with. And that's what importers are seeing already. So they are seeing that, and they are choosing where they send their products. We saw that with salads last year. They chose not to send it to the UK because the retailers were difficult. So this is the reality of what we've got. Now, what I do want to finish on is actually, I know that it's time for change. Will and I were talking about it at the start. A big part of that is a mindset. So the mindset has to be, things need to be done differently. And I know that they can, as a buyer, I had to make changes every single day. If I didn't, then I lost my customers. I know that it's time for change, and I also know where that change can start from. That change can start from everybody in this room. Think about the people that I spoke with. It was 40 people, 1,000 years. We have 500 people here. How much experience is there in the room? The change can happen, and it can start here.
So, now I can't really see any of you very well because there's a light shining in my eyes. Have I got some people with roving mics? Yes, I've got some hands up, brilliant. So if I could have some hands up in the audience. We are going to go straight to Q&A with you all. We did discuss whether we would give you reflections, but we don't want to waste time. I can see a hand up over there at the back, number 3. I'm looking for more hands. There's one over here and one over there. So we'll go in that order.
Hello, Sarah Bell, farmer from Rutland. What we're talking about here is a broken societal contract. What is the one thing we can all change in our day-to-day business that will help to mend this? Thank you.
Great question, Sarah. Thanks very much. I don't know whether Tom would like to start.
Thanks, Sarah. Always an easy question. I think one of the biggest challenges that we all face, and society as a whole, is that none of us are paying the true externalities of any of what we're consuming within society. And that's exactly the same with food. And so the burden on farm to produce ever more sustainably with an ever greater environmental conscience is only growing, and is only going to grow over the next decade. And yet the ability for the supply chain to put a value on that and to pay for it, because at the moment the consumer doesn't value it, is incredibly difficult. So while it's not a direct answer, I think we have to work out how the whole of society recognise the externalities of a growing global population and of 70 million people living on an island, and who is it that's going to pick up the cost of those externalities? Is there a role for government? Is it a public good that's being delivered by reducing those emissions, by becoming more sustainably and more environmentally conscious? Or is it something that the supply chain and the consumer has to pay for in the price at the retail shelf? Because until we understand who is going to pick up the cost of becoming more sustainable and reducing those externalities, we're going to go round and round in circles and not find the solution.
Thanks, Tom. Chris, what one thing could either you or Asda change?
Go back to what should farmers do, and I think the first piece is to understand where you are in the supply chain. The number of farmers I come across who go, I'm a customer of X grain trader or whatever, you go, well, no, you're a supplier to those. And a supplier mindset is very different to a customer mindset. The supplier tries to do what the customer wants. And I think there's a piece around that, and the chair summed it up really nicely, talking about the fact that we are now 50 years since we had politicians describing what markets would do. And Ged said it. It wasn't so much that there's abundance, but actually subsidy, government policies were driving production. And that has now been gradually removed. And I look back, 1998, Herr Fischler turned up and said, we're going to market liberalise, we're going to reform CAP. I think we all went, marvellous. And this is the result. This is where we were going to end up. We're going to end up in a world which is much more volatile. There's no intervention. There's no management by politicians. We need to understand what that means for our business. I'm sure that's at the macro level, but I think that's the biggest takeaway that I would put, as again, Chairman said, the challenge to the thinking.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that because I think there's a lot in that answer, Chris. Thank you. I'm looking to you both.
Yeah, but I think one of the biggest changes actually it's mindset between, particularly about long-term and short-term. I think if you look at society generally, then I think there's a lot of short-term thinking. And that's certainly, I've seen that actually, is that it has to be that change, because actually they need to be thinking long-term, but actually what changes can we make? Actually, we have to change. Everything doesn't come immediately. And that's certainly, I saw that as a buyer, and that's working with farming. So, and actually that is, if you're a buyer, your mindset might be very much the next 12 months. Ali with apples, you're thinking about 7 years further ahead. So there is that change in mindset and time frames.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, as individual farmers, one of the most important things is to supply the market and not oversupply the market, because supply and demand dictates the price. You know, we're all in a produce market, and if you overproduce, you're going to get less for your product. So the days of saying that I'm going to grow a crop of X tons and there'll be 10, 15, 20% over, I think you need to change your mindset. There is no point in producing 50% of your product and making a profit and then losing money on the rest. So my advice would be try and keep the market in balance as much as you can. And an undersupply is most definitely better than an oversupply. The buyers will tell you that's not acceptable. You have got to supply 100% all the time. But my advice would be try and hit that, but if you're going to hit any target, hit it under rather than over.
Very sound advice. Yes, I want to give that a round of applause. I'm going to take a couple more questions in the room and then I'm going to go to the app. I've got one here and then there was one at the back in the corner.
So I recently came back from COP28, and there was a lot of emphasis on farmers adopting innovation and innovative practices to drive net zero and build resilience. But innovation often comes with a risk of the unknown, and how can we expect farmers to take that kind of risk when we're running on the empty bank accounts that you mentioned?
Yeah, very good question. I don't want to dominate, but I'd quite like to, from my own point of view, as an apple farmer, where we've got a lot of really positive things in terms of the crop that we're growing and the relatively low emissions for that crop. We're not turning over soil every year. There's a lot of really positive things about being an orchardist, but the risk has become too great. And what we're now seeing is orchardists pausing their planting, because it's actually it's the biggest investment is a new orchard. And that's why I started with the word profit. If the sector's not making a profit, if the business is not making a profit, can't afford to reinvest, the risk is too great. So that's my answer. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, a huge amount of this comes down to confidence as well. And if there's not the confidence that you're going to generate that profit, Ali, then you're not willing to reinvest and you're not willing to take that risk. And as an early adopter, very often there is an abundance of risk, and actually you make a lot of mistakes. And very often those early adopters, they're ahead of the time where the productivity grants may come out of government, and you take all that risk privately. And so there's a question here I've read about, do we turn to government too often? But actually, for the early adopter, I think there is a role for having an off-list productivity grant where you can go to DEFRA and say, we want to innovate. We want to do something that's pretty extreme, that's a little bit unknown, but we need your support. And it doesn't fit any of the criteria that your current grants do, because then it will incentivize those early adopters to really push the boundaries. And then it's those people that push the boundaries that ultimately becomes mainstream in 10 or 15 years' time and has really driven that productivity curve, reduced the emissions, and delivered everything that society needs. So I think there is real merit in looking at how we incentivize the uptake of those really early innovations.
There is, and I think one of the things in my interactions with government that I would make a plea for is to embrace the complexity of the sector that we're talking about. Food and farming, horticulture, it's so complex and the risks differ so greatly. So in order to actually innovate, the innovations are so vastly different. And we need policymakers who can wrap their minds around that complexity and stop looking for the quick soundbites and the quick wins. Certainly the quick wins aren't working for our sector, and they're probably not working for your sector at the moment, because we're complex, we're complicated. Anyway, Chris, would you like to have a go at that question?
Well, I think food retailing thrives on innovation. We will launch 250 local products in Scotland alone. So we are the best place to bring that innovation to. I very often have farmers saying, I've got a great idea of a product, can I supply you? And I say, no, why don't you go and do it in a farmer's market first, and then you can scale up, learn how to deal with, and there are ways of means of being able to do that. I think the bigger question, which Tom started to address about other global markets, scare the hell out of me. If I wanted to offset Asda's total emissions, and it's in our ESG report, it would cost £1 billion+ a year, and that's not feasible to do. And there's another reason other than the cost. I don't believe the numbers. I wish we would stop talking about emissions as an industry. It makes us sound like we're jet engines, pulling oil out of the ground, putting it into an engine and burning it. We're not. We are the industry that does carbon capture and storage like nobody else. So let's talk about our global warming impact rather than emissions, and then we can go to government and say, let's have a level argument with the other sectors which operates, and as Tom said, the other parts of societal impacts on the environment. Yeah. Sorry, preaching over.
Very, very good points. And I think you'd both like to add about the risk-reward ratio in terms of emissions, net zero.
Well, one of the things that I heard about as well was water, and one thing we have got at the moment is a lot of water, and actually investment in there, if you've got investment that's going back into the sector, and I heard this from a number of people actually, what they want to be able to reinvest, they want to be able to, and one of the things they're reinvesting is reservoirs. So how can they build more reservoirs so that actually the water is then captured and is used on the land? So, but that does require the profit that Ali's talked about to shift in the food supply chain.
Yeah, and it requires a planning framework that works. But that's somebody from Herefordshire speaking, where it takes 3 years to get an on-farm reservoir approved. And I think those policy issues also need to be addressed. There was a question in that far corner.
Yes, thank you very much. Tom Allen-Stevens, Oxfordshire farmer. I lead the British On-Farm Innovation Network. Is the red tractor the right vehicle to bring to the supply chain a British farmer's greener farm commitment? And is it right that the British Retail Consortium plays any part in it whatsoever?
The elephant in the room. Shall I go first?
Have you got the answer?
No, I don't have the answer. I don't think anybody has the answer right now. I think there are all sorts of issues, but I think just tuning into your question, Tom, and trying to answer it, is red tractor the right vehicle? It's one of a number of vehicles that will help us make our farms more environmentally sustainable for the future. There's been a huge amount of publicity and noise around red tractor greener farms, but no, it's not the only answer, and there are already other answers out there, leaf being one of them. Tom, I don't know whether you want to add anything.
I mean, I would say anybody that's 30 years old is due a full review. And I think what we need to look at is, what is the purpose? What do we expect farm assurance to deliver? How can it deliver that? And then come to the conclusion of exactly what it is and how it is delivered. Red Tractor has recognition that the very few farm assurance schemes have. So I think from a starting point, it is the right vehicle. Whether it's going to be run on red diesel or green diesel, I think is a legitimate question. What is it that we're going to be asking that farm assurance vehicle to do? We've heard about the inspection burden that some of these businesses are facing. That is unsustainable. It's unsustainable for the whole supply chain because of the cost element associated with that burden. We cannot continue without substantive change to work out how we make sure the food that we as farmers produce enters our consumers and they know it's safe. But it does not require 40 audits across the same food producing business. And I think that's absurd. So I think it's very timely that we have this full and frank review as to what it is that's delivered. I think my question that at the start about externalities, what we need to understand is who is going to pick up the cost of driving environmental sustainability within these businesses? Because there is real cost to it. And if we are simply going to expose ourselves to imports that don't have that same burden, that aren't expected to jump through the same hoops, then we are going to make ourselves less competitive. So I think there needs to be a much wider understanding of how we make sure that British food and farming remains competitive while delivering all of those other requirements that the supply chain is going to force upon it.
Yeah, so what I did keep hearing about the audit burden. As Tom said, the audit burden is there. And actually what we've got is we've got a system that actually is over-audited. So there's a reason why British produce and farming is actually the standard it is, and part of that is the audits and the way that it is monitored, but also it's got too much. So that needs to change. So every single retailer needs to think, well, how can I simplify what I'm doing so we have a standardization? Because there are far too much on it, and it drove me nuts as a buyer to seeing, because what I see there is its cost that's being added in. And as I was looking at how can I reduce costs, and that has to change.
Yeah, I don't know too much about the red tractor, but we have a similar thing in the egg industry at the moment with new standards that the RSPCA want to introduce. And there is a strong feeling, I think, among farmers that there's people sitting in offices making rules and regulations that they don't have to live with, but we do. And it is all done on the back of improving welfare. And I would debate that a lot of this stuff doesn't actually improve welfare. We are world leaders in the UK in producing free-range eggs. We are the best in the world at it. And I don't think we need more regulation. I think, if anything, we need less regulation. There is so much things coming down the line to hamper us nowadays, And we've all got to be green, and we've all got to get better. Of course we do. We've always got to improve. But I don't actually think that a lot of the red tape and all the stuff that goes with it is really necessary. I mean, we're just waiting at this very time to have a BRC unannounced audit, which was, I think, between October and February, some time in there. But we also get audited by all our customers as well. Why do we need that? Surely the BRC is enough. That's set up by the retailers, but still they think they need audits as well. And it's the amount of time that this takes, and it's a huge cost to any business. And, you know, it's a report, and, you know, we've always had glowing reports, and that's great. You know, we're very proud of our business, and I've got nothing to hide, nothing at all. But, you know, I do wonder of the benefit of a lot of these reports.
Thank you, Robert. Chris?
So Tom will correct me if I've got the numbers wrong. On the Red Tractor board, BRC is one voice amongst 18. I don't think that that's an undue influence. And we are supportive of farm assurance, a variety of farm assurance schemes, as Robert has said. And why is that? Well, a lot of it is down to the Food Safety Act 1990, which introduced the requirement for due diligence. We have to show that we have been diligent in looking at the food safety of our supply chain. If you don't want to be farm assured, you need to find another customer, because we can't take that risk. And Tom talked about the value, and actually, sorry, it was Ged talking about the high standards of British food. We've got to demonstrate it. If you don't have a national scheme, then you're going to have me coming up your drive, you're going to have Tesco's coming up your drive, you're going to have other people coming up your drive. And I do think that, and Tom rightly said, people are talking about being able to measure externalities. And within supply chains, we're going to measure externalities. You're going to need to find a vehicle to do that. Your opportunity is to have a national scheme to do that, or a variety of different supply chain models.
I think the problem, though, is we have national schemes and then we have the layers, sometimes just added on by each of the retailers you serve. And those of us that serve 2, 3, 4 retailers, I know one apple grower who's serving 2 large retailers. He's an apple grower. It's not raw meat, it's not raw chicken. The audit burden used to be one person's job. It's now 3 people full-time, and the number of people across the business that are involved, it adds up to 7,500 hours a year. And I think, going back to Jed's point, that is a cost that is taking profit out of our businesses, because it's not being paid for. So I agree with you. We need to stay legal. We need to stay safe. And I think, personally, I want to be part of a feed system that is perceived as one of the safest in the world. But I think there's a more efficient way of doing it.
You can't just be perceived, though. You've got to be able to demonstrate it. And if I had one message to come out from conference, we're going to have to record and verify data much higher standards than we ever have before. That's the way that the future is going to be, like it or lump it. And I also think that maybe your friend ought to find a different customer.
Oh.
Well, that's the reality. You need to make a choice on this who you're supplying, because I don't put bolt-ons onto mine, and it's a net cost, as Ged will tell you, when you're presenting your option to a buyer.
Chris, when we talk about data, this is where there is, you open up a whole minefield entering into this area, because at the moment there's still 60 different carbon calculators. There's no agreed methodology. You use the one that suits your business. And if we're going to start talking about data, we have to have absolute belief that what we're providing is giving us the correct outcome. And then that those imports are also expected to produce exactly the same. Because we probably end up in a position where we need carbon border adjustments. So that there is a carbon tax at the border, so that if we can demonstrate we are 50% of the global average for our red meat production, then actually there starts to be a real market value to being less than 50% of the global average. But the calculators at the moment, the way we account for methane, it's all very complicated. And I think there's a lack of trust and belief in the farming industry that it's representative of the way we produce food and of the role of carbon storage in our soils and all those sorts of areas. So how do we get to a system where we all have trust in the data that's being put forwards?
I utterly, completely agree. That's what I said. I don't believe any of those numbers at the present moment in time.
But you've just said we're going to have to do it.
Yeah, we're going to have to get there. DEFRA, to be fair, is through the data transparency as an eco working group trying to work out how to calculate it. We've had the Environmental Audit Select Committee in Parliament looking at this too. How anyone is able to set government policy saying they're going to reduce carbon in agriculture when no one agrees the way we're going to measure it and how we're going to report it is beyond me.
Okay, I've got a lot of people sitting on the app patiently asking questions, and I'm going to try and take some that have been voted to the top, and I'm also going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the screen to get the ones that have been coming in more recently to try and be as fair as possible. I can see I've got a hand up over there, so if I could have a mic to go there, and I've got one at the back there. We'll come to you both after these. So the top scoring question, I'd be delighted to hear what you have to say about this. Politicians, I hope you're listening. Do politicians recognise the strategic importance of domestic food? Oh, I might just repeat it. Do politicians recognise the strategic importance of domestic food production? Where shall I start? Chris, what's your view?
In an election year? And I'll quickly add a quick code that yes, when there's a food price spike, which we then say there's a food security debate.
So they're probably rubbing their hands with glee at the moment that we've been selling vegetables at 15p over Christmas, and that's helped bring down food inflation.
Indeed it has.
The cynic in me, I can't help it. Tom, what's your view?
The language has certainly changed, Ali. We hear very regularly now that food security has risen right up the agenda. But I think we've got a wonderful opportunity over the next year for all political parties to demonstrate that they recognise the strategic importance of domestic food production and that they have a real commitment to delivering more food, more British food at home and abroad. Because if they do that, Ali, then they will deliver the policies that underpin the profitability, the transparency, the fairness in the supply chain, the water management, the planning, and all those other things that unlock the productivity gains. But if we don't recognise that strategic importance, then the policies we need to flow from it will never be delivered.
This is technical, but the bit that I can't see it shifting until food is seen as a public good. Because at the moment, it's public money for public goods. And for those of you that don't know, food is not classed as a public good.
I mean, I think the geopolitical landscape globally is incredibly concerning. And I sure we'll hear from our politicians later on, anyone who sits in this room and thinks we can take food production for granted when we've had rationing twice in the last 15 months is a fool. And I think we now need our politicians to recognise the impact of climate change, to recognise that geopolitical impact, and to work out a plan for feeding 70 million people living on an island. Because we have a wonderful opportunity as British farmers, as food producers, if they recognise the strategic importance of domestic food production.
Okay, I'm going to move on. I've got loads of questions on the app. And actually one that's just come in sits with a question that we were debating amongst ourselves. And that was whether or not retailers are opposed to long-term contracts. The question that's come in on the app is how to incentivise buyers to think longer term with a wider focus than price. Chris, I'm inevitably going to look to you first, but I wouldn't mind some input from others.
I think this is really tricky. We have very motivated, competent people that join our business wanting to be buyers. And they do a great job, but they then want to get a bigger job. And there's a reality, which is if they grow their business, grow their category by 5–10%, they want to get out of that category. Because next year they're going to be judged, and someone mentioned short-termism. Well, yeah, we're all short-term, and we only think on an annual basis. There will be lots of conversations about year-on-year growth and the Christmas figures coming up. And so they want to move into bigger areas. They want to have bigger and better jobs. I don't think that this piece about can we hold someone in a job for 5 years is feasible, in all honesty. What we can hope is, and we do see this, is that they start off with a junior job in, say, beef buying or the land buyer. They move into other areas, get better skills, and come back as a senior buyer overseeing junior buyers. So I don't think these skills are lost. I think they're built upon, but it's a reality.
Ali, I know there's one business who very proudly told me, I suppose nearly a year ago now, that they have actually been offered a 7-year contract with quarterly pricing mechanisms, because the sustainability teams within that buyer have recognised that sustainability is a long-term game, and you can't play this on short-term contracts. And I think the short-term annual negotiation may just about have been fit for a time of very stable inflation. But we are in a very volatile climate today, and to think that we can go into annual negotiations with the volatility we have today, I mean, even things like the national living wage has gone up 9.8% from the 1st of April, but businesses expected it to go up 7.4%. So there's a 2.4% increase there that was completely unbudgeted by all those businesses. Now that has to make its way through the supply chain.
So a quick build. I've just signed a contract with Arla until 2027, so that's not a problem. You know, the longer term contracts, we have contracts with suppliers where they will fix 6 months or 50% of the volume and trade the other as spot. So we will, depending on what the supplier wants, will amend our contracts.
Yeah, I think both of those examples, though, are quite rare. I don't hear about many long-term contracts within our sector. And I personally agree, I completely concur. I think it has to be the future. That, as farmers and growers, has to be what we're seeking. And strategically, I think our businesses need to be having that dialogue and having those conversations and saying it's what we want.
For me, one of the things, as a buyer, what I recognise, my first main responsibility is availability. So that's what a long-term agreement is. That's what I'm buying. I'm buying availability. So it's not about having a fixed price. So, and actually, because there is far more volatility in the market now, these long-term agreements need to reflect that volatility. And that's what Tom said, actually. We've moved away from an era. I worked in an era as a buyer where things were not as volatile as they are now. So the agreements need to be there, and buyers need to understand that. That's what. But also, think, well, how do I have a legacy? What am I leaving behind as a buyer? So when I've left and moved on, what have I left behind? Where am I going to? So that's what we needs to change with the buyers. And again, that's the mindset of the buyers that they need to change. Actually, it is that long term, and long term agreements are the right thing. It's not about being open book, but it's having agreements that work for both parties to secure availability.
You have a long-term deal, Robert.
Yes, we do. We have a long-term deal. I'll give you a wee bit of history on it. 3 years ago, we were telling the buyers that there was an egg shortage coming down the road. They didn't listen to us, and we had a few things happening. Obviously, we have avian flu, which was devastating flocks. We had the move away from colony production into free range, which was requiring a fairly major expansion and a big investment by the UK egg industry. And it just wasn't happening. We had 2 years where we actively tried to recruit new producers, and we could just get no one to do it because the economics just didn't stack up. And then when you threw in avian flu, it was just never going to happen. And then, of course, on top of that, we had the Ukrainian war, which pushed up the price of grain and pushed up the price of energy, and farmers just said, enough's enough, I'm going to stop producing. And that's exactly what happened. So, we had a shortage on the shelves. And, buyers, I honestly think buyers is the only thing they really understand is when there's a shortage. And an empty shelf doesn't make anybody any money. And there's none of us want to see empty shelves. But it's the reality of the thing, and that's what happened. So we went back to our customers and we said, if you want to have UK egg, you've got to invest in the sector. And it's an investment from them to get the production they need. And that's what they've come up with. They've given us, we have a 3-year rolling deal. After 3 years, it rolls on. It is based on a ADAS tracking. which is a totally independent thing. You know, it's got to be fair to both parties. You know, it can't be biased to one side. So we have got that. We review the price every quarter. So everything is taken into consideration. The original trackers were really only based on feed. 60% of the cost of producing a dozen eggs is feed. But that's not enough. It's hopeless. You know, you've got to have all your costs built in here. So we have succeeded. We have got that. We are lucky, I think, in the egg sector in so much as we have the Lion. And the Lion, all the major supermarkets are signed up to the Lion, which means that importing eggs is harder for them. So we're lucky there. Other sectors maybe don't have that. And, you know, the Lion was obviously started during the salmonella scare 35 years ago. But, you know, the imports that's been coming in from Poland and Ukraine, there's been, I think, 200 cases of salmonella poisoning caused by that product. So, you know, we have a better product, you know, and we need to get out there and tell people that.
I had a question here. Thank you. There you are. And then I think, I can't remember where the other one was. Hands up if you had, thank you at the back, thank you.
Thank you. It's Andrew Swift from Ferrer. I'd like to take us back to the opening question, if I may, which I thought was absolutely on point for this topic, about the societal contract and the consumer's perception of the value of food. In a country where the average family chicken costs less than a pint of beer, and yet one of our most iconic waterways is in terminal decline as a consequence partly of intensive poultry production along its catchment zone. How does the panel think the experiment of the penny retailer in Germany, in Nuremberg last year, how do they reflect on the output of that experiment, and whether or not, for example, Chris, how would such an experiment go down at Asda, where consumers for a week's period were invited to pay the current cost or the environmental cost of the food product?
Thank you. That's a great question, and it ties in. There is one on the app, which is who should pay to make food production more sustainable to reduce emissions. So it's in a similar vein. Chris, I don't know whether you want to start.
No, I'm not aware of the Nuremberg, the German experiment. I guess my point is where I've come from before, which is people will pay for the quality and it can be demonstrated. I don't think we have the metrics to do that. And I apologise if that runs across what other people think, but you know, what am I going to get for the money? And what are my customers going to get for the money? Because they need to see that right the way through. And I think there's a huge void between ambition and reality and being able to deliver. And I'll give you an example. We have 1,000 acres of cover crops on our potato production system. Fantastic, great work and everything else. But I also employ an entomologist to go and run nets through that, so I actually know what biodiversity I've generated. Otherwise, those are flower beds. They look fantastic, but they're not actually generating biodiversity, which is what I would describe them as. And I think there's a whole pile of work around that. We're doing work on, like lots of other retailers are, and other supply chains, on soils and water quality and everything else. I don't think we have agreed, until Tom raised it before, until we have global agreements, national agreements on how those things are measured and delivered. I think we are probably over-promising and under-delivering to a customer.
I'm afraid I've got a clock that says I've got 5 minutes and 47 seconds, but I'm getting signalling that says, no, you've got to stop. So the clock's wrong. I've got a lot of very agitated people at the back of the room. Thank you all. I'd like to thank my panel, firstly, for getting up here, opening session of Oxford Farming Conference and taking questions. And I'd like to thank all of you and those of you online and on the app for participating. Thank you all very much.